I'll give a short introduction while we're hopefully giving people some time. So today's daf in Masechet Gittin is daf Chaf Vav for 26. Yesterday on Shabbat we got up to the Mishnah, so it's a good place to start. We'll do a Mishnah till a Mishnah today, but this continues a theme, and I'll give a little review, but because it's important. It's a topic we've come over and over and over, which is whether or not the writing of the get is essential, right? So the fundamental argument between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Meir about whether Eidei Mesira Karti or Eidei Chatima Karti, meaning does it matter who watches the giving of the get, in which case, according to Rabbi Lazar, you don't even need to really write signatures on the get. You do, and if you do, they have to be kosher. But in reality, what matters is giving over the get and the witnesses who observe the get that was properly written, given over. Or Rabbi Meir says Eidei Ktiva are really Eidei Chatima really are what's really important. And so the writing of the get is essential. We've had several Mishnayot in last parak that discussed issues related to the writing or not writing, right? And remember, according to Rebbe Lazar, most of that is not that important. The writing is not that important. A kid can write a get, etc., because the writing is not what matters. Our Mishnah continues, and we'll see who it's going according to. But our Mishnah gets to the point that we've also mentioned before, that every shtar, including a get, has what we call two components, a tofes and a toref. The tofes, tet vav pei samach, is the generic part of the get, where you write the things, every legal document. I don't know anyone who's a lawyer on this call, but every legal document has a lot of legalese, right? So there's a lot of generic terminology that has to be included that is time consuming, probably to write, and costs money, especially if you're poor, right? But is generic. And that's called the tofes of the document, saying, in this city, on this time, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe the date's not part of that. And that's not very specific. But the toref is considered to be the part that's personal, the part that says specifically his name and the location and the date and all of that. So says the Mishnah, Hakotev Tofse Gittin, a person who's writing Gittin, and you're writing basically, you want to have a stack of contracts ready so that it's a slow day, right? So you're preparing for when people will come in. Says the Mishnah, you can do that, but you have to leave behind, you can't write the name of the man, the woman, and the date, okay? A man and woman is because of Lishma. The date we discussed earlier was because, a couple of reasons, but there were two major ones. One is that we don't want a person to change the date of the get to protect a wife who had an affair, right? So a man finds out his wife slept with someone, but he likes her, even though she's cheated on him. We said earlier it was his niece, right? One of the pitfalls of marrying in the family. So he wants to protect her. So he writes, I gave you a get yesterday, right? So that the get would imply, or you don't write any date, but she takes the get and says, I was already divorced. So therefore you have to write a proper date so that we know when it actually happened. The names are because of Lishma, we think, which sounds like Rabbi Meir, right? So you have to leave those places open. And if you do a milveh, if you're writing shtari milveh, if you're writing a document of a loan, again, you can't just make a pile of loan documents that say, Ruvain lent Shimon $100, Ruvain lent Shimon $100, Shimon lent Ruvain, you can't prepare these all in advance. If you're writing shtari milveh, tzarich sheyaniach makom hamalveh, you have to leave blank the name of the lender, makom haloveh, the name of the borrower, makom hamaot, the amount of money, and makom hazman, and the amount of the date of it. And of course, the date for a loan is critical, because if Ruvain lends Shimon $100 in a shtar on Monday and then sells his field, Shimon then sells his field on Tuesday, the person who bought the field from Shimon is on the hook in case he doesn't pay off the loan. He's going to have to give that field to Ruvain because it's mishubad. So the date obviously is critical. And if you're writing shtarei mekach, you're writing contracts, not loans, then again, the same idea. The purchaser, the seller, makom hamaot, the place for the sum, makom hasadeh, obviously you have to later on put in the specific field, umekom hazman, and you have to write the date, and that is all mipnei takana. We're going to see in the Gemara what is mipnei takana. There was some takana, I don't know how you translate takana in English, some decree, some rule that was led to this halacha. We'll see what all of this in the Gemara. That's the Tanakama. So you're not allowed to, you can write the tofes, you can write a star, but you got to leave aside the personal parts. Rabbi Yehuda says, Posel B'Kulan, you cannot write any of these documents ahead of time. It's all possible. You can't write anything. You've got to wait till the person comes in front of you and says, I want to lend money, and then you write the star. Or I want to divorce her, then you write the get. Rabbi Lazar, Machshir B'Kulan. Rabbi Lazar says, no, I think you can write shtarot ahead of time. Chutz mi Gittin nashim. The only exception is a get, like Rebbe Lazar Shita, of course, that a get has to be written lishma. Shenamar v'katav la lishma. It says that a get has to be written specifically lishma. It doesn't say anywhere that you have to lend money to someone lishma, right? So it does. It only applies specifically by a get and not by anything else. So it seems to be that there are three opinions in the Mishnah, which we'll see in the Gemara, that the Tanakama holds that you can write a get for a woman ahead of time. You can not write the whole thing. You have to leave blank the man's name and the woman's name and the date. And you can write, same thing is true about lending and selling. You can write documents, but not specific details. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't write any documents ahead of time. And Rabbi Lazar says you can write documents, but not a get. So other documents, but not a get. Now, Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel, I just want to add that everything you just heard from me, says Yehuda Amar Shmuel, me, Eli, is wrong. Because not only do you have to leave behind the names in the get, the man's name, the woman's name, the date, you have to leave aside the words that are the essential get, which are you are mutar to every person, which are the critical words of the get. And what that implies is it's Rebbe Lazar. But unlike that, I explained the Mishnah to you that the Tanakama seems to be Rabbi Meir, who doesn't really care, Rabbi Meir, that it's essential in terms of what you write in the get. In fact, and Rebbe Lazar maybe would disagree. In fact, our Tanakama is also Rebbe Lazar. The Amar Ede Mesira Karti. Rebbe Lazar says the thing that matters is that you have Ede Mesira, but Srichem, B'inan Ktiva Lishma. You need to have, when you say the Katavla, right, because the Katavla is, the Edim are not the Edim on the Chatima, right? So the Katavla does not mean and you sign it, it means you write it. And according to Rebbe Lazar, since the Ede Mesira are what matters, it has to be written Lishma. It says in Maritzricha. Now, if you recall, last week in the Daf, and Daf Chav Aleph and Daf Chav Bet, so 4 or 5 days ago, both of those, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel said a very similar thing in the previous two Mishnayot in the previous parak, right? It says Gemara that we go like Rebbe Lazar, but we need all three cases. Because if Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel only said this in the first case, meaning the first Mishnah back on Daf Chav Aleph, that we go like Shmuel basically, excuse me, then I would have said, only in that case, remember that was a case where we had the discussion about when you write a get, can it be on something that's attached to the ground, right? So there, I would have thought, Lazar, that's where we hold that you can apply that Mishnah to be like Rebbe Lazar, who says, Mishnah says you cannot write it, right, on something that's attached to the ground. The Katani ain kotzfin, right, because that you could say, that the Mishnah says that you can't write it on something that's attached to the ground. And then it says, V'katani kitzvu, that if you do write it, this is what you do, right? So you might think that's, that's where Rebbe Lazar's opinion is, that although you're not supposed to do it, there's a chance you could do it if you fulfill certain conditions, as Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel said before. Aval Seifa, but the end part of the Mishnah, meaning the second Mishnah on Daf Chav Bet, which said, that you can't have a get written by Cheresh David Katan, a get written by someone who's not competent. The Katani, and the end of the Mishnah said the words, Ein Kiyum Haget Ela B'Chotamav. The final part of the get is only with those who sign it. So you might think, well, that sounds exactly like Rabbi Meir, right? That it's Edei Chatima, Edim who sign it who count, not the Edei Mesira. So Ema Rabbi Meir here, you might think that Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, the Amar Edei Chatima Kardi. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that the Edei Chatima are the ones who make the get happen, and it's not going according to Rebbe Lazar, and that's where Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel to say that even that Mishnah can be dolchek to go like Rebbe Lazar. But if Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel only told me both of these two cases, meaning the first case about attached to the ground, the second case of Cheresh David Katan, I would have said, Ahinami Ikaluk Reb Elazar. Okay, you can explain that Mishnah according to Reb Elazar. Avalha, but if you look at our Mishnah can't possibly be Reb Elazar. The reason is because the third opinion in our Mishnah was Reb Elazar. So how could the first opinion be Reb Elazar if the third opinion is Reb Elazar, right? So the Mishnah said you can write a get, you can write the tofes of a get, you got to leave behind the essential parts, right? And then Rabbi Yehuda said you can't write anything, and then Reb Elazar said you can write other shtarot but not a get. So you might think, well, obviously the first part of our Mishnah is not Reb Elazar, right? Ema midasefa Reb Elazar have Reisha lav Reb Elazar have Tzricha. Therefore, Shmuel needs to come and tell you no. And even the first part in our Mishnah is going according to Rebbe Elazar. We'll see why you need to have two parts according to him. But that even the first part of our Mishnah is going according to Rebbe Elazar, right? And when Rebbe Elazar says that really you don't need to necessarily write Edei Masira are what matter, right? And however, even so, the person who the critical part of the get, Harei Amutar D'Chol Adam, has to be written for her, and therefore, since that part is that part has to be left blank and can't be included in the pre-written get, because even according to Rebbe Elazar, that's a problem. That's how you understand the Mishnah. Now, so that's what Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel said. Now, the Mishnah continued, if you recall, and said that all of these things, right? The end of the Tanakhama was, if you're, again, I'll read the Mishnah, I'll read it outside. You're writing the tofes of the get, you have to leave behind certain parts, right? And the Mishnah said, Mipnei takana. The reason for that is because of the takana. Now, what's this takana? Meaning, what's the gezerah? What's the concern? What's the issue that led to this halacha? My takana, okay? So says Rabbi Yonatan, there's a few opinions we're going to have here, three opinions actually. Says Rabbi Yonatan, Mipnei takanat sofer. The reason that we are worried, right, is that we're worried about takanat sofer, meaning we're worried about doing something to help out the person who writes shtarot and gittin. We're worried about the sofer, and our Mishnah is going, of course, says Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar. It's really Rabbi Elazar, the Amar Edei Masira Kart, right? Rabbi Elazar says that the ones who matter when you do a get are not the signatures. The signatures are not the ones who need to be the Shema. The person who matters the most, well, they do, but we'll see in a second. The person who matters the most are the Edei Masira, the ones who watch it being handed over. And because of that, you're not supposed to write any of the get without the intent of the specific person, right? Because the katavla, write it for her, according to Rebbe Elazar, means you should write the get, the entire get, specifically for the person, Lishma, of who you want to divorce. So really, according to Rebbe Elazar, you shouldn't write any of the get. V'dinhu da'afilu tofes nami lo lichta. In fact, the halacha would be that you're not supposed to write even the generic. The tofes, remember, is the generic parts of the get. You're not supposed to write it because you're supposed to, according to Rebbe Elazar, have the entire get written Lishma. Why did the Tanakhama of our Mishnah, who Rabbi Yochanan says is Rebbe Elazar, permit you to write the generic parts of the get, even not for that specific woman? That's Mishum Takanat Sofrim Sharubam Rabbanan. In order to help out and to fix things for the sofer, the Chachamim said it's okay. What does that mean? The sofer, it's a lot of work, all right, in that time. I think it's still a lot of work for someone to write things if you don't have a printer, right? And you're writing it by hand. And the shtar could be, a get could be long. A lot of it's generic. You don't really need most of that writing. So it would be very difficult if 2 people or 3 people showed up at a sofer and said, we need a get. You'd have to say, you got to come back next week, right? And lose the business or delay their divorce. And really, we're saying for the sofer. So because it's a lot of effort and because we are worried about them being able to do it, we made a takana that even according to Reb Elazar, where you're supposed to write the get completely for her sake, we allow you to at least write parts of it that are not specific, right? That are generic. Now, that's the first opinion. That's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. So the takana is why you're allowed to write certain parts, even though according to Rabbi Elazar, you would think you're not allowed to. Okay, Mishum takanat sofrim shar Rabbanan. Rabbi Yehuda then, keep going in the Mishnah, is posel bikulan. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't write any of this. Why does Rabbi Yehuda say you can't write any of it? Because Rabbi Yehuda is worried. He's worried that Gozer Tofes Atu Torah, right? He's worried that we're Gozer the Tofes, meaning the part of the get that's non-specific. You can't write that because we're afraid if you start writing that, you're going to write the whole get. You're going to write the specific thing. So we had a Xera that although you're really not allowed to write the Toref, you should be allowed to write the Tofes. So if you decide I have Xera, I'm worried that if you start writing parts of the get, even the permitted parts, people are not going to distinguish, and you're going to write the prohibited parts, Shelo Lishma. So Rabbi Yehuda prohibited the whole thing. And furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda went even further, and he was Gorez Gazar Shtarot Atu Gittin. He said, not only because I'm worried about this by get, which is the only place where you really need it Lishma, I'm going to be goes by other contracts as well. And I'm going to make a general rule that you can never write a contract in which you don't explain and do it for the purpose of the people coming in front of you for the contract. And the reason for that is that we're afraid that if you start having, generic contracts where someone writes, Ruvain borrowed $100 from Shimon, Ruvain borrowed $200 from Shimon. You make a whole list of these things that people are going to come to do that same thing for a get, and it'll be prohibited for a get, and therefore it's not permissible. Okay.
The Torah is not it's not that long, right? I mean, it's not. It's
It's
just
not
it's just one
right.
page. It shouldn't take that long to write.
I completely agree, which is why it would be very attractive to write the Tofes and have 10 of these ready. You could just put in those, 4 lines, let's say, or whatever the Torah is, right? It's not even 4 lines, but so I think that's the point. The point is that they were gozer that you can't do according to Rabbi Yehuda, right? They were gozer, according to the Tanakama, which we're saying is
I
Rabbi
understand.
Lazar, they permitted you to do it for exactly what you just said. You leave out the Torah, write the Tofes, have a stack of these, and be ready to go. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we're worried. You're not going to stop. Now, of course, we've talked about this before. Like, what do you mean? Who are you going to write the get in? But, it's very conceivable, and everyone can imagine this, that, everybody knows that the neighbor is fighting with his spouse, and that there's something going on. And the sofer might think it's worth my time on a quiet day to preemptively write this get. I'm ready. We'll see this more in a second, exactly what we're worried about. So anyway, so that's what Rabbi Yehuda says, that you are posel b'kulan because he made a gzera, that you can't write the tofes, we're worried because you're going to come to write the torif, which is the specific part, and where goes are all shtarot because you're going to come to write git. And then the third opinion in the Mishnah is that Rabbi Lazar is machshir b'kulan. Rabbi Lazar, meaning the second opinion of Rabbi Lazar, is that you can write all shtarot in the world, chutz gitei nashim, except you can't write any part of gitei nashim, right? Because tofes atu toref gazar. Rabbi Lazar says, according to this opinion of Rabbi Lazar, the second one, that I agree that by a get, you can't write the toref, and it's best not to write anything. But other shtarot, no one's going to confuse shtarot atu gittin lo gazar. We're not going to make a mistake to confuse a sale of your car with a get, and therefore you don't have to make a gzera about that. And so that's the second opinion of Rabbi Lazar. So that's how you understand our Mishnah. The problem is, says the Gemara now, that the last words in the Mishnah blow apart your whole theory. Because Rabbi Lazar said in the Mishnah, machshir b'kulan, he's machshir in all shtarot, chutz mikitei nashim, shenamar v'katav la l'shma, right? It says, write it for her. Now, it says the Gemara, shenamar v'katav la, now 2 lines from the bottom on Amud Aleph. What do you mean that Rabbi Lazar says because it says v'katav la? But remember, katav la is referring to the essential part of the get. Hakiktiv la atorifu dichtiv. When it says v'katav la, it's referring to the torif because the only part that's specific to her is what the torif is. The tofes, by definition, are parts that are generic, right? That do not specify her or anything about the relationship. So how could Rabbi Lazar be bringing a proof from the katav la that you're not allowed to write the tofes of a get? It's not what katav la is referring to. Says the Gemara, no. What he meant, al ima mishum shenemar v'katav la lishma, because it said v'katav la and it's lishma, therefore they made a gezerah. So therefore you need to have lishma by a get, unlike every other, a star in the world. You don't have to write a sale of, of any contract lishma. And therefore, because you need the toref lishma, they made a gezerah for the tofes atu torif. So he's not saying why they were goes. He's not saying the pasuk is why you can't write it. The pasuk is why they make a gezerah. Turn the daf where we chavvav. Sorry, I'm a bad. Ask the Gemara in the top line. I don't get this problem. How could Rebbe Lazar in the first part of the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, say that you're allowed to write a toref of a get, but not a tofes of a get, but not a toref of a get? And then at the end of the Mishnah, Rebbe Lazar says you can't write any part of the get. So kasha to Rebbe Lazar, it's a contradiction in the Mishnah itself of Rebbe Lazar in the first opinion, to Rebbe Lazar in the third opinion. And the answer that we always give is that there's a machlok about how to understand Rebbe Lazar. Trei Tanai Aliba de Rebbe Lazar. There's two opinions according to Rebbe Lazar, and they argue about how far Rebbe Lazar goes about this gezerah, which you can see that really it's essential to write the toref l'shma. Do you make a gezerah about the tofes or not make a gezerah about the tofes? And the reason that you would conceivably not make a gezerah is mishum takanat sofrim, right? Because we want to help the sofer to have a livelihood and to write their gittin and their shtarot. And so we want to help them. That's why you're allowed to write anything. But obviously the question is, how far does that go? And it doesn't go all the way.
I don't see why you can't just say katavla. You have to write the whole thing lishma. So you don't.
So I mean, at least the way we explained it before, and Rashi quotes this on Amud Aleph, is that the katavla implies the part that's specific to her.
I don't see that. I don't see why that has to be.
Because the rest is not specific.
I understand, but still, it's just maybe a special thing about get.
Fair enough.
The whole thing has to be written lishma for her.
I'll give it to you. I don't. That's not how Rebbe Lazar understands it.
I understand, but I think you can make the argument. I don't see why that gets cut off. But
okay. Right. So that's the first way to understand the takana of our Mishnah. Says the Gemara on the second line of Daf Chavav Hamabet, Reb Shabti Amar Chizkiah says that no, you misunderstood the Bnei HaTakana. The reason for this is not because of a takana of the Sofrim, it's Mishum Kitata. The reason that we're saying in the Mishnah that you shouldn't write the get is Mishum Kitata, meaning the Mishnah is because of fights. We'll see what the fights are in a second. Meaning our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. This says Reb Shabtai, our Mishnah is going according to Rabbi Meir, to Amar Eidei Chatima Karti. Rabbi Meir says that the signatures on the get are what matter, and therefore, in essence, when it says V'katavla, it's referring to the signature, and there is no requirement to write a get l'shma. It says the Gemara, therefore, as we've said before, B'dinhu, the real halacha is, Da'afilu toref nami lichtov. In fact, you could write a get. Remember, Rabbi Meir said before, you can find a get in the garbage pail, right? It says the man's name and the woman's name and the date. You can pick that up and use it to divorce your wife. So in fact, you don't need to write anything l'shma. And if you're a sofer, you can start making all these kinds of gittin with different people's names ahead of time, in theory. Really, you should be allowed to even write the specific parts of the get. But the reason that they don't let you is mipnei hatakana. What's the takana? Because zimnin, the shamale might be, obviously the situation, Rashi always speaks, or sometimes speaks this out, that you have two people fighting, everybody knows that they're having a marital problems. The sofer gets a wind of it and writes a get. And of course, the woman somehow hears that I was in the sofer's office and I saw a get with your name on it, right? Zimnin, the shamale, the sofer, the kakatid, right? She hears that the sofer is writing a get with her name. The savran, the wife thinks, Ihu ka'amar lei, that the sofer is not doing this on his own initiative. My husband told the sofer to write a get, and he's going to surprise me, on Thursday night with his get. And havile katata ba'adei, and of course that's going to lead to Gittin, right? They're going to have a fight because of that, or it's going to exacerbate the fight. And therefore, because of that reason, so really you should be allowed to write it according to Rabbi Meir. But the Chachamim said this is really bad practice. It's not a good idea to start writing Gittin to forecast divorces that have not been settled yet. And therefore, you should not write the specific part, but we don't really care if you write the generic part. And that's the opinion of the Tanna Kama. That would be going according to Rabbi Meir. That's the second opinion. Rav Chisda Avimi says, I think Mishum Takanat Agunot, that the takana that allows us to write a tofes of a get, the generic part, but not the toref, is because we want to protect women from being agunot, from being abandoned. We'll see what that means, because it doesn't mean what it usually means, always. And in fact, it could be Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Lazar. It could be either Rabbi Meir or it could be Rabbi Lazar as the first Tana in the Mishnah. How could it be either one? So let's explain it. Says the Gemara, Amrilei Rabbi Meir. You could either say that it's going according to Rabbi Meir. And again, Rabbi Meir says, Eidei Chatima Karti, right? That the ones who matter in the get are the signatures, and the writing is not so important. And Ibadinhu Dafilo Torif Nami Lichta. So from that source, you would say there's no problem with the sofer writing even the specific personal parts of the get. However, we're worried. Zimnin, there's a couple ways to understand this. I'll say Tosis first because it's a little clearer. But Zimnin, the Havilek Tatabahada, we're worried that they're going to have a fight, right? Meaning they have a disagreement. Everyone in every relationship has disagreements. And Verotach Allah, the husband's going to get really angry with her. Vizarak lanihile, if he's got a get, so he doesn't have to then, they get into a fight and he says, okay, I want to get a divorce, go to the sofa, get it all set up. You have time to process, to calm down, to seek counsel, etc. We're worried that if a husband has a get waiting at the side, that he will act very quickly and he will throw it at her, meaning give her a get, and he will abandon her and leave her there. So according to this reading, which I just said, Igun here does not mean what we usually mean by aguna, which is a woman whose marital situation is unsettled, so she can't get married, etc. Here, we're using Igun as being abandoned. Basically, a husband will divorce his wife legally, halachically, but in a way that will be much too easy and will lead to women being divorced in too frequently or too easily. And therefore, the rabbis wanted to make it a little bit harder for a husband to do a divorce, and they didn't want him to have a get ready. That's I think the simplest way, and that's the way Tosfot explains that the word igun does not mean aguna in the regular way. And the Kiva Eger here, you see that little dot, quotes that Tosfot later. The Rashi has a whole nother shot here, a little bit of a shot that maybe it's referring to a case where he's going to throw it at her. You have to change the gears a little bit. And we're going to have this many times more in the Masechta, this whole big question where if you throw a get at your wife, there's a safek karov la, safek karov lo. When it lands, did it land closer to the man who threw it or closer to the woman? If it's closer to her, she's divorced. If it's closer to him, she's not divorced because he never gave it to her. And then, of course, a bird comes and picks it up and runs away with it or something, whatever the case might be. A hurricane comes. So then in that case, of course, there's doubt forever. Did he divorce her or not divorce her? And then she's really an aguna because she can't get remarried. But obviously that seems like a very side issue. So Tosas implies that we're not using igun the same way we usually do, but that's why we wanted to make it harder to do a get. And you could also say the other way to read this, Amri lei Reb Elazar, that the Tanakam of our Mishnah is Reb Elazar, in fact. The Amar Ede Mesir Karti. Reb Elazar holds that the ones who give it over matter, and in fact you have to write the whole get l'shma. And therefore, we really don't want you to write even the generic part of the get, not for her, but we allow it mishum aguna. What's mishum aguna? Because zimnin debai lemezelam dinatayam, right? We're always worried, and this unfortunately sounds like it was not so uncommon. We're worried a man's going to have to run away, right? Or he's going to go on a business trip, and he remembers, oh my goodness, I have my passport, but I forgot to write my get, right? So, which was an essential thing before you went on a boat or something back in those days. So, or he's running away from the authorities, right? So you don't have any time. So he's running away. He again wants to write a get in case I don't come back, or in case something happens to me, so you don't fall to yibam, etc. But lo ashkech safra. But he can't find a sofer, can't find a scribe, and so Shabbat Leva also he's just going to run away and leave her, and ma'agena motivla, and she's going to be waiting, never know if he's going to come back. Never know what happened to him. And so because of that, we want to make it a little bit easier to have part of the get ready, even according to Rebbe Lazar. And therefore, that's why they allowed you to write the tofes of the get, shelo lishma, but they never allowed, of course, to write the toref of the get, shelo lishma. So those are 3 or 4 interpretations of the Mishnah.
Well, how does this throwing the get at her apply if they...
No, that was the first case. So that was if you go according to Rabbi Meir, we're worried about the throwing the get.
But it wasn't filled in though, right?
No. According to Rabbi Meir, we're worried that, remember, Rabbi Meir's concern was that if you have an easy get, Rabbi
Yeah.
Meir says you're allowed to write a get shalol l'shmaril. But we stopped you from writing the
whole
complete
thing,
get.
the whole
The whole
thing.
thing you could, because all that matters is a day chatima. But we don't want you to write a whole get because we don't want you to be too available for you. He's just going to throw it at her every time you get angry at her.
It doesn't have to be dated?
So it's a good question. The date is not part of Lishma. We're about to ask about the date in a second. But you could presumably either add in the date or it has to be dated, but you'd have to add it in.
Before you throw it, you have to add
Correct, but that's a small addition, I guess.
Well, no, I mean,
Or maybe you have one for every day of the week.
it has to have the year too, doesn't it?
That's true. Yes, but again, the date, just to be clear, you do have to have the date. But remember, the reason for the date is not because of the Shema. The reason for the date, there were two opinions. I'm going to repeat them because it's critical for the next line of the Gemara. The reason for the date was either so that we can determine when she was actually divorced, so she can't use a get as coverage for an affair. Meaning she slept with the person while she was still married on September 1st, husband divorced her September 15th, and then he write a get without a date. She can always go to court and say, no, I have this star and I was already divorced. And her husband might lie and say, I divorced her earlier. And we said, why would a husband lie if his wife cheated on him? And we said earlier, because she might be his cousin or his niece or something, right? So he wants to save her from death for adultery. So he might lie, and therefore we want a date in the star, in the get. The other explanation before, this was all last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, was because of property. Right? Remember that a woman who's married, her husband gets her nichsei melud, right? If she owns property, he gets all the dividends, he gets all the fruit until they get divorced. Once they get divorced, she gets it all back. And if he keeps taking, he's got to pay her for it, right? So he's got to pay her for all the fruit that happened after the time of the divorce. The question, of course, and she can sell it, and she can, out of his hands. So the question, of course, is when do they get divorced? It's very critical to establish ownership over nichsei malug, which are the possessions that she brought into the marriage that we'll leave with, but while they're married, he gets all the benefit from. So that is why you write this man. Now, says the Mishnah, says the Gemara now, the Mishnah said that a critical part to the get is Mikom Hazman. You have to write the date. Now, Kapasik Vitani, our Mishnah did not say you have to write the date in certain circumstances. Right? Kapasik means it's universal. It just said it. Meaning, Lo shna mina nisuin, lo shna mina irasin. It doesn't matter whether they are married fully, quote unquote, nisuin, where they consummated the marriage, or irasin. Remember, irasin is where a man goes to a woman and says, Hariyat Mukudeshadli, but they don't live together yet. He doesn't sleep with her officially yet, or he's not supposed to sleep with her. She lives in her father's house until he does nisuin and brings her to his home. That could be for a year or a month or 5 years even. During that time, she's an Eshetish for all matters. But importantly, because she lives with her father, the husband's responsibility to provide for her is very limited, right? And remember, we learned all about this in Ketubot. He doesn't have to redeem her if she's captive, because his redemption of her is instead of her possessions, right? She gives all her money to him so that he does that. And there are other halachot. Now, our Mishnah implies that whether a man is giving a get to his wife, mina nisuin, or mina erisin, he has to write the date in the get. So, Bishnua mina nisuin, I understand why you have to write a date if you're married, because whether the reason is the first one I just told you is that we're worried about a woman who has an affair, but the husband sort of predates the get, or doesn't predate it, but says it happened earlier because it's his sister's daughter, right, his niece. So that is concerning because a woman from Erisin, also let's just read Nisuin is a concern. And if the reason is because of the fruit from her possessions, he gets her fruit. Once he's divorced, she doesn't get it. We need to establish a date where they transfer the possession. Elaminha Erisin, but if you're talking about a woman who only has Erisin, so they're married through Erisin, but they have not done Nisuin yet, and then if he wants to break up that Erisin, he needs to give her a get, and she can't marry a Kohen, right, because it's a real marriage. But I get it, that if the concern is that she's going to have an affair and he's going to help her cover it up, that's a concern, because he still likes her. It's his bat achoto, it's his dear niece, right? And she's not allowed to sleep with someone from Erisin. In fact, remember, Nara Murasa is even worse than Nisuin, right? Elamandam Rishon Peri, but if the whole reason you have to write the date is because we're worried about how to assign possession of the food, of the property, Arusami Itle Peri, A husband has no right on his wife's possessions until he does nisuin. So there's no implication. He never married her for nisuin. So why do we care when the get was, right? So Amar Rav Amram, now says Rav Amram, I wondered this all the time. Hamilta shmat minei deula, shimat minei deula. I heard from Ula that this is the reason that we put a date in a get, even if it's from Erison, is damar mishum tekanat vlad. It's because we're worried about what implication it's going to have for their children. And says Rav Amram, I didn't understand what Ula was talking about. What do you mean, what children? They're not even, they haven't consummated the marriage. So what children are you talking about? But later, even the Shamita Lahaditanya, later I heard the following Braita, and the whole thing became clear to me. Because what does the following Braita say? Homer, let's say a person says to his messenger, Kitvu get la rusati. I love these cases, right? I mean, I should laugh, but they're very, very far-fetched. So this case is a person is engaged to a woman and he's planning the wedding. We have something to do with prenuptial agreements, right? So this is a prenuptial get. So before he says to the sofer, write a get for my betrothed, right? My arusa. And because in case I may, we have a wedding set up for a month from now. I don't know, maybe I won't like her after the wedding. Maybe we'll get all the wedding presents and then I'll give her a get. Again, I don't know. It's the cases are obviously, I don't know why a person would do this, but I want to have a get ready, not for now, right? I want to go through with the wedding, but I want to have a get ready for the future in case I need it.
She doesn't know. I mean, that's the problem. That's even.
There's a lot of problems here, right? Well, that's the case. So does it work or not? Says that's the Braita. Says the Braita, ain't no get. That's not a get. Now, Amar Ula, why not? Matam. Why isn't that a get? I mean, why can't he write a get? That I divorce you. So remember, that is called a get yashan, right? Remember what a get yashan, if you recall, Rashi says it's not a get yashan, but Rashi says it is. A get yashan is a get that's old, and we interpret it, and we're going to discuss this more later, that a get yashan means a get where a husband wrote a get to his wife, and then before he handed the get to his wife, he slept with her, right? And we say later that a get yashan does not work, and it's puzzle. And the reason a get yashan is puzzle, or not necessarily slept with her, but he was mityached with her, right? But certainly if he slept with her, more so. Because, as Ula said, mishum tekanat havlad, because we're worried that this kid is going to be born, right? She's going to become pregnant. They're going to sleep together. She's going to become pregnant. If you look at the get and you do the math, right? The date on the get is January 1st. The kid was born, whatever, 6 months. No, sorry. The kid was born whatever amount of time later, right? So the kid was born, I don't know, a year or so later, right? And the thing is that the get was not written, the date on the get, the time it was written was January 1st. The husband didn't give the get to his wife till a year later, let's say, or whatever, 6 months later, in which case they were able to be married. He slept with her kosher. She became pregnant. This kid is a legitimate child. But if you forget about the kid's birth date and the circumstance around everything, the kid's birth date, you forget about the circumstance around the whole business, you might come to think that this kid was born out of wedlock, right? He was born when they were not married. And so because of that, they made a takana that you should never write a date in the get, and therefore give the date of the get prior to when you're actually giving the get to the woman, right? In this case. So says Ula, Matam Gzera Shema Yomru, Gita Kodem Livna. People are going to come to say, oh, wait a second. The get happened on January 1st, because that's the date that it was written. Now, it turns out it wasn't given then, because 3 months later they got married. 3 months later, he gave her the get. But because it was written earlier, people are going to come to say that the get happened before she became pregnant, and therefore the kid is illegitimate, and it's going to be bad for the child and his reputation, and therefore they didn't allow you to do it. So once I read that halacha of Ula explaining the Braita of why you can't write a get to an arusa, I understood. Hakanami zera shema yomru kita kodem livna. Here, I have the same problem. The reason you have to put the zman in the arusa is because we're worried that he's going to write a get to an arusa, but he's not going to give it to her. I don't know. He writes the get. He's not so comfortable with this engagement, so he writes a get. Right. But then he decides, I'll give it another try. I'll go through with the marriage. And then he goes through with the marriage and he sleeps with her. She becomes pregnant. And then he says, it's really not going to work out. And he gives her the get. So even though at the time he wrote the get, they were arusa, we require you to write the date in it because we're afraid that if you don't write the date, people are going to come to confuse this get and think that the get was given earlier and that the kid is illegitimate. But therefore, we make you write the date. And obviously, once you write the date, you can no longer use it at a later point. Because since the date is written there, and the date is not going to match up to when you actually give the get is not going to be enforceable. And that's why we require you to write the date.
Have we talked about like how they dated things, or we?
It's a really, really good question. We're going to discuss it. Yes. It's a great, great question. And actually, it's very practical, of course, because it applies to Gittin and you have to write. So the Gemara will discuss it. And then there were conventions and it was Alexander, right? They gave it to. But anyways, we're going to discuss this in detail. Amar Reb Zera, Amar Baba Bar Shila. We're like 12 lines in the bottom. Said Reb Zera in the name of Reb Abba Bar Shila, Amar Reb Hamnuna Saba. This statement's going to have a lot of yichus to it. He said in the name of Reb Hamnuna the elder, Amar Reb Ada Bar Ava, Amar Rav. All the way back to Rav, we have a strong, strong tradition. Halacha ki Rebbe Lazar. In this whole debate about Ede Chatima Karti, Ede Mesira Karti, do you need to write a get lishma or not? Halacha is like Rebbe Lazar, you have to write the get lishma. Kari Rav led Rebbe Lazar, and Rav used to call Rebbe Lazar Tuvyanna de Chakima. He's the most blessed. He's the best of all the rabbis, and that's why we pass him like him. He was the one who we revere. Ask the Gemara, well, that's very interesting about a get. But in our Mishnah, Rebbe Lazar said that this applies to other shtarot too. But is that true? Right? I'm sorry, he said the opposite, right? In our Mishnah, Rebbe Lazar said this is only true about a get. By other shtarot, you're allowed to write it even ahead of time. So is Rav passing like Rebbe Lazar in that regard as well? Filo b'shar shtarot nami, asked the Gemara, question mark. Amar of Papi mishmei de Rava, Rav Papi said the name of Rava, which was a couple generations later. Hi asharta de Dayani. These asharta, I don't know how you translate the word asharta, but the case of asharta is where witnesses would basically go to court, right? And they would try to certify that like you have a shtar. It says Ruvain owes Shimon $100, and on this date, and it's signed by two witnesses, by Yehuda and Levi as witnesses. So in order to establish that those witnesses are correct, what happens is the witnesses go to court. They stand in front of the Dayanim and they say, Yehuda and Levi, we signed this, we're kosher, we saw it happen. And the judges will then write, in front of us, Yehuda and Levi signed their shtar, established the veracity of their testimony, and therefore the shtar is good, and you can take it and collect anywhere, right? So that's what Asharta de Dayani is, this ratification that basically the Dayanim saw the witnesses, they came in front of us, and they said, it's okay. Right? Rashi quotes the words.
They're translated here by judicial certification.
Okay, perfect. Rashi quotes it if you want to read it in Rashi. It says, B'motav tlata havina, we were in front of three judges, Va'atu ploni uploni, and so and so and so and so came. Va'asido achatimot yadayo, they testify that this is in fact their signature. Va'ashrenuhu, and we certified it. V'kaimu kidechavi v'chotmihem. Right, we certified it as they signed it. So this was a promissory kind of thing, a certification. Now, those were things where, again, these witnesses show up in front of court. The judges are sitting there. So you would think that the court scribe would start writing on the shtar this whole thing because you're about to go in and have it signed by the judges, right? But Rav Papi said in the name of Rava that if it's mikatva mikamei de l'sadi sadi hachatimat yadayo, if you write the text in preparation, right, while they're waiting in line, before they actually said to the judges, we confirm this is our signature, it's psula. It's not kosher. In fact, what they have to do is they have to go to the judge, say the thing, then go to the scribe who will write it, and then go back to the judge who will sign it, right? Alma michsika shikra. You see that it looks like a lie. If you write it before it happened, it seems like you're saying facts that are not yet facts. Hachanami michsika shikra. Here too, why would we possibly like Rebbe Lazar that you can write a shtar? It says Reuven borrowed $100 from Shimon. It wasn't true at the time you wrote it, and it looks like a falsehood. It says the Gemara Veleta, but that is not correct. In fact, we do paskin like Rebbe Lazar. Meet the Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, Omer Haya Rabbi Meir, Afilu Matzo Ba'ashpa. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that even if you find a get lying, it doesn't have to be a get, but we're talking about a get, lying in the garbage dump, Chatamo v'natznola kasher. If the writing was done for a totally different purpose, we don't know why it was written. But as long as you sign it, because remember, Rabbi Meir holds Edei Chatima Karti, as long as you sign it and give it to the woman, it's a kosher get. Now, the rabbis argue, but Afilu Rabbanan lo palig aled Rabbi Meir el begitei nashim. But they only argued with him about a get because it has to be the katavla and it has to be l'shma, the beginning kitiva l'shma. Avol b'shar shtarot lo. They didn't argue about other gittin. And so it turns out that if you find a document in a garbage pile or, in some pile, that as long as it has the right words and you subsequently sign it, that would be okay. So we are passing in this Gemara, like Rabbi Elazar in our Mishnah, that by a get, Eidei Chatima, Eidei Ktiva, Eidei Nesira Karti, and therefore has to be written Lishma, you cannot write a get except for the Tofes, Shalol Lishma, right, the Tofes, right? But in other shtarot, you're allowed to do it. The Amar Ravasi and Rabbi Yochanan, this is the concluding line, says, as Ravasi said, name of Rabbi Yochanan, if you have a shtar, Shalavabo Upara'o, right? You borrow money with the shtar. Ruvain lends Shimon $1,000. And Shimon hands a shtar to Ruvain and says, I borrowed $1,000 from you. Okay. Shimon goes back, he goes to the bank, and the bank says, we'll give you a better deal. So he goes back to Ruvain and says, I want to give you back $1,000. I don't need your $1,000 anymore. So he gives back $1,000 to Ruvain. Ruvain gives him back the shtar, right? So Shimon now holds the shtar. The bank falls through, right? They won't sign. And so he goes back to Ruvain and says, I changed my mind. I need the $1,000 again. Says the Gemara, right? Says Rav Asi and Rabbi Yochanan, since the shtar was borrowed with once and paid back, even if every fact in the shtar is still true, it's the same day, it's the same lender, it's the same money, Eino choser v'lo vebo, you cannot go back and use that shtar again for another loan because shekvar nimchal shibudo, because you already gave up the shibud, the responsibility of the shtar. So meaning the shtar comes along with it that all my property is meshubad. When I paid it back, that went away. You can't use the same shtar again for that purpose. But the point here is, the reason you can't use it is because it no longer works as a shtar. But we're not worried that this shtar was written for a different purpose and you're using it for another loan, basically. That is clearly not a concern. And so we end up asking in this Gemara that we don't worry about pre-written shtarot that are kosher, except for a get, where we pass like Rebbe Lazar, that you need to write a lishma, and therefore you can't write the essential parts of a get ahead of time. There's a machloket in our Mishnah between the Tanakama, according to Rebbe Lazar, and the third opinion, according to Rebbe Lazar, whether you can write part of the get, shalol lishma, and if you could, it would be because of takanat sofrim, right, or because of agunot, because we want a get to be available if you need it. But everybody agrees that you can't write the essential parts of the get, shalol lishma, according to Rebbe Lazar, and that's how we do it. And we will stop there, and thank you for the patience. Miriam's going to pick it up there tomorrow morning at the Mishnah on Daf Chav Zayin.
Thank you, Ali.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.